fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was divided, or defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. The accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. When the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the two wings of the great eagle, that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. The serpent poured water like a river out of its mouth after the woman, to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman, and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and holds the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. All right, so we're in a new chapter, a new section of Revelation. For a long time now, we've been in these two cycles of seven. We had the seven seals, and we had the seven trumpets. And there will be another cycle of seven that appears later in Revelation. It's kind of introduced in chapter 15, but the seven bowls come into play, particularly in chapter 16. And so those are the three big cycles that John explicitly references in his book. Some have tried to find additional cycles of seven, particularly trying to find one in this section of chapters 12 through 14. Because you have seven, the seven seals featured so prominently previously, the seven trumpets, and then the seven bowls, a lot of people expect there to be some kind of seven in these chapters here in the middle of the book. However, we need to recognize John is very explicit regarding the other sevens. I mean, he's very clear. You've got seven seals, seven trumpets, seven bowls. It's very explicit. They're outlined 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I mean, it's very clear that those are intended to be taken together as a whole, and that there are seven of each of those. So I think we need to be careful about forcing additional patterns and structures upon the text in this middle section when he has been so intentional about when there's a cycle of seven he wants us to be aware of. He's very clear. And we don't see that in the same way here in chapter 12 through 14, and really chapter 15 as well. As we look at these sections, much of the preceding chapters, that first half of Revelation, has been focused on the execution of judgment against Israel. You have the wrath of the Lamb being poured out on apostate Israel for their rejection of Jesus, their murdering of Christ, putting him to death. And so that unfolding of the seven seals, the unfolding of the seven trumpets, very clearly is centered around and focused on God's judgment and the wrath of the Lamb coming against Israel for their apostasy and wickedness. Well, now that we've come to chapter 12, that theme is still going to be present in the second half of Revelation. We're going to see here that the scope is widening beyond just Israel. Rome is going to become more prominent in the second half of the book. It's going to be introduced more explicitly. You have, even here in just this chapter 12, the persecution connected to the satanic activity is definitely at play. And that's going to be connected with Rome and Rome's involvement with it, and judgment coming against both Israel and Rome at the end of the day. And of course, then later on, the end of the book of Revelation, John moves to the future, considering things at the end of time, the new heavens and the new earth to come. For this chapter in particular, there's three sections here. The first section is what we're going to focus on tonight. That's verses 1 through 6. The second section is verses 7 through 12. And then the final section is verses 13 through 17. These sections, of course, all go together. The whole chapter is one kind of story or image, so to speak, even though you have these different signs that appear. They're all connected together. You kind of have three different parts to the narrative. What this chapter is doing is it's presenting a cosmic or a broader spiritual perspective of the events being described. You have this woman. You have the dragon. You've got the war occurring in heaven, the dragon being thrown down to the earth, and all these things going on. It's presenting this broader spiritual perspective of what's going on. In fact, one scholar has put it this way, and I think this is a helpful summary. The main point of chapter 12 is the protection of God's people against Satan because of Christ's decisive victory over Satan through his death and resurrection. The purpose is to encourage the readers to persevere in this witness despite persecution. In fact, you should notice in the middle of the chapter here, like in verse 11, it talks about, they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives, even unto death. You recognize the central role that Christ, and particularly his death and resurrection, plays in this chapter, though there's a lot of other things going on as well. The foundation for Satan's being defeated and the triumph of the church, or the preservation and perseverance of the church, is that Christ has already won and has defeated Satan, even though Satan is still at work and is still active and is still making attacks and threats against the people of God. So just wanted to say all that by way of introduction as we're kind of moving into a new section now of the book. Any particular questions before we start to dive into some of the particulars here?
You mentioned that we start to see Rome more prevalent.
Yep.
Is Satan more prevalent too? Or have we seen him in...
We have seen him before, the angel from Abaddon, that kind of thing. He's very prominent in this chapter, which is a little bit different, but him being presented here as the dragon. And he's going to be active as well in the second half of the book. But for example, in chapter 13, when you have the beast that comes up, we'll talk about a number of those things, but there's a lot of connections with the beast and the heads and other things connected with Rome. And even in some of the details here in chapter 12, the dragon is not Rome, but the way the dragon is presented parallels descriptions of how Rome is described later on in the book. So there's a connection being drawn. And so Revelation is not just about Israel, but that's what we've focused on so far. And that will continue in the second half, when you have like the harlot, things like that. But there you have kind of an alliance together between the harlot and Rome, joined together basically on the side of Satan to attack and persecute the people of God.
Harlot being...
So you have in chapter 17, the great prostitute and the beast. So this great prostitute that's talked about in the book, I believe that's a reference to Israel because of their spiritual apostasy. Yeah, their spiritual adultery. Best way to put it. Yeah, Trevor.
Revelation 11, you say it's the judgment of Israel and the victory. And then chapter 12 goes over that from a spiritual perspective and continues on to all the men.
So chapter 11 and a lot of the preceding sections, that's focused on God's judgment upon Israel. Here in chapter 12, you're kind of transitioning a little bit to a different focus. Rome's going to play a lot more prominence. But chapter 12 in particular is it's presenting in a very vivid imagery. It's presenting the cosmic struggle between Satan, God, and the people of God, and Satan's desire and attempts to destroy Christ and destroy his people, his failures and thwartings, and how God continues to care for his people. So even though you can kind of take it in this sense, just as Satan tried to destroy Christ, so also Satan is going to try to destroy the church. And just as Christ thwarted Satan and was able and even was taken away up into heaven, so also the people of God are going to be preserved and are able to conquer Satan through the blood of the Lamb. And so even though Satan is still trying to persecute the church, remember that's the context for a lot of the audience, this is an encouragement to them despite the persecutions they're facing. This is a reminder to them that Satan does not win, and Christ has already accomplished the victory and he will fight on behalf of his people.
So the battle continues, not just because God has avenged Israel, but he continues.
Right.
War.
Yes.
Satan.
Yes, there's still spiritual warfare going on even after the destruction of Israel. Yeah. All right, so let's look at some of the details here. The first sign that we see, the first image we receive, is this woman in verse 1, clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains in the agony of giving birth. So the first question we have is, well, who is this woman that's being described here? I believe that this woman is a representative of the corporate people of God, the covenant people of God. It's not unusual for the people of God to be described as a woman, particularly in the Old Testament. There's a lot of imagery that's used and being described as a woman. And even Paul in Galatians 4 talks about, he uses Sarah and Hagar as representatives of the people of God and people who are under the law and not under Christ. And so that's common language that's used in the scriptures. And in fact, even the imagery of giving birth is used in the Old Testament prophets. Sometimes it's used in a positive sense, sometimes it's used in a negative sense, but it's not unusual language in the Old Testament. And so when we see this woman here giving birth, at that moment of giving birth, it's not a big stretch to see her as being a corporate representative of the covenant people of God. There are a couple of things here just from the imagery that help us to see that as well. This imagery of sun, moon, and stars is very unique. We don't really see other characters described quite in this fashion. Being clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. But we do see similar language and imagery being used to refer to the people of God in the Old Testament. So one example is from Genesis 37, verse 9. This is one of Joseph's dreams before he was taken as a slave into Egypt. The first one, of course, is the sheaves of grain that bows down to him. But the second dream, in Genesis 37, 9, it says, "Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." So there you have all three, sun, moon, 11 stars, not 12, because, well, Joseph would be the 12th star. But that dream is interpreted as his parents and his brothers. So that's his father Jacob is one of the patriarchs, and then his brothers, representative of the tribes of Israel, all bowing down to Joseph. Now, of course, this dream is talking about what's going to happen in Egypt when he's going to be sent away, and he's going to rescue them, and he's going to be elevated to the second in command of Egypt, and they're going to come and bow down before him. That's what the dream is specifically referencing. But it's interesting that the imagery that's used is sun, moon, and that number of stars representing the people. Another interesting passage is from the Song of Songs, chapter 6, verse 10. Song of Songs, of course, is a difficult book, but I think the best way to interpret this book is as if the Song of Songs means the best song, it's the best love song. While it uses the imagery of human love, ultimately it's about the relationship between God and his people, ultimately expressed as Christ and his church. And so when we see the male figure who represents Christ speaking of the church, or speaking of the woman, we should interpret it as being spoken of as the church. And one of those verses where we see that at play is chapter 6, verse 10, where the male figure representing Christ says this: "Who is this who looks down like the dawn, beautiful as the moon, bright as the sun, awesome as an army with banners?" So this then should be understood as a description of the church from Christ, where you have references to beautiful as the moon and bright as the sun. So there you have those two images being brought together, referring to the people of God. The fact here that we have the 12 stones, the 12 stars as a crown on her head, very clearly, number 12, very clearly in Revelation connects to the people of God. You've got the 12 tribes referenced, you've got the 12 apostles referenced in different places. That number regularly in the scriptures, that's what it's referring to. I think another good Old Testament example of this is that on the high priest's breastplate, he had 12 stones on it. And the 12 stones represented the 12 tribes of Israel. And so this woman, dressed with the sun and the moon, with the 12 stars. Just that imagery together helps us to see that this is a representative person representing the people of God. Interestingly enough, Roman Catholics interpret this woman as Mary. Part of the reason, of course, is that the woman gives birth to Christ, and so they try to find a very particular reference. Of course, then some of the other language about her being given wings and taken away, they make all kinds of stuff out of this. But part of the problem with this interpretation is that in verse 17 it talks about the rest of her children that the dragon then goes on to make war against. And so we see there that she's not just an individual figure, because that verse is not talking of, well, one, it's very awkward for Roman Catholics because they say she didn't have any children. So that doesn't make sense. But also, we shouldn't interpret that as Satan missed out on Jesus, and so then he went after James and the other, literal, siblings of Christ. Well, yeah, it should be understood as that broader corporate category, not just an individual. The woman is a corporate figure. And so I think the best way to understand this then is as the covenant people of God. So any questions on the woman that we see here introduced? John and
So this is representing the church, not just Israel.
That's a good question. I think my answer to that would be yes. And the reason being is that it's representing the people. I use the language people of God because it's more of the ideal, as opposed to like here on earth you have the church. The church is the people of God. The church includes believers and unbelievers. So that's the difference between like the visible church and the invisible church. Where the visible church is always going to have corruption while here. But you have here this idea of, with the birth happening, that's I believe that's referencing the birth of Christ. So that, or particularly in context, is Old Testament. But then the woman continues after the birth of Christ. It's talked about with the 1260 days. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But you even have her being referenced beyond that as well. And so that's leading into New Testament church. And so that's why I think I'm more generically speaking of the covenant people of God, because I see her here as kind of crossing both the Old Testament and the New Testament time frame, because of the birth of Christ happening here at the beginning. So she has to be Old Testament before then, but there seems to be New Testament reference after. Does that make sense? Yeah. Were you following up on that, Randy?
Yeah. No, you threw me there when you said the church represents believers and unbelievers.
So I don't think. Right. So, what was I trying to say there? I don't think the woman here is representing believers and unbelievers. What I'm trying to say is that this is a corporate picture presenting an idealized version. More, I don't want to. I'm not saying necessarily the invisible church, but when she's representing the covenant people of God, she's representing those who are truly of Christ from the broader spiritual perspective. Because when we come here on Sunday mornings, we've got 80, 90 people in there. Lots of them are Christians, but not necessarily all of them. Because the church here on earth, there's always going to be corruption. Same in the Old Testament, same in the New Testament. That's why Paul says not all Israel is Israel. Just because you're physically descended, physically part of it, does not mean you're spiritually part of it. When the woman is when I'm just talking about the woman representing the church, I don't mean it in that sense of what we have here on earth of the mixed group, but rather it's the idealized, those who are truly of Christ. That's what I was trying to say.
I guess the term that keeps going through my mind is the church is the bride of Christ.
Yeah. Yep. So that's another good example.
That would not be believers and unbelievers, right?
Yes, correct. Yeah. But that's a good example of the same kind of language, of female language, the bride, being representative of the people of God. Yeah. Trevor, did you have a question?
So the woman, why wouldn't she be married? Because
why wouldn't she be married?
Yeah. Because Gabriel was sent specifically to a virgin of Nazareth.
Yep.
We don't know why, but she was chosen by God, and maybe the 12 stars that she had was handed down to her son, who had the 12 stars in his hand, which are the churches. So, and then in her Magnificat, she paid homage to or Abraham, and the promises that God made to Abraham. So Mary remembered all that and verbalized that in her song. So the church could not exist without a heavenly, without an earthly mother giving birth to the Messiah, because all the Jewish people women were always hoping that one of them would be the mother of the Messiah. So Jesus was born of Mary. He was recognized by Simeon and Hannah on the 8th day after his birth when he went to the temple, and we made predictions of what would happen afterwards and how Mary would be affected. So the foundation of the church would include Mary, just as Jesus.
Not in the. We need to be careful with that kind of language because, right? Yeah, and I know you don't mean it in that way, but so this can't be Mary for a number of reasons. One, you've got a lot of symbolic language here that is used to describe the corporate people of God. It's not used to describe Mary. Mary's never described with 12 stars anywhere else in the Scripture. So there's nothing where that language of 12 stars here should make us think Mary. 12 should make us think the 12 tribes, which is corporate, not an individual. And along with that, you have the fact that she's prepared by God in the place in which she's to be nourished for 1,260 days. The 1,260 days is the same length of time described in the beginning of chapter 11, which is a reference to that 3.5-year period of 67 to 70 AD. Mary's dead by then. So it can't be Mary at that point. And then the fact that she continues after that into the war of heaven and everything else that takes place, that can't be literal Mary. It has to be a corporate group at the end of the day. So now, I mean, Mary is the one that gives birth. She's the individual. But what's being described here is that of Christ being born of Israel in Bethlehem, in fulfillment of all the Old Testament prophecies, but he's born within the context of the covenant people of God. It's not referencing her as an individual. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know it is not referencing her, but referencing a woman giving birth. Now, in heaven, there's no birth.
No.
Birth.
But again, the Old Testament prophets use this language a lot, talking about the people of God. Sometimes they use birth language in judgment. So sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. Sometimes it's used negatively to describe the pain and suffering of birth, but it's connected with the hardships of Israel, and particularly with like stillbirth, giving birth in the wind, where there's no actual fruit from it, though you go through the pain and hardship. But sometimes it's described in a positive sense of the joy of birth and kind of the restoration of God's people. So the language of giving birth is often used as imagery in the Old Testament regarding the corporate people of God. And so it's not unusual at all for Revelation to use the same event, a woman giving birth, and applying it as imagery to the people of God. But
the other question is, there's a similarity when she gave birth and the Magi came and Herod tried to kill all the babies.
Oh, yeah.
And,
I'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah.
And Joseph was told in a dream that he should take them to Egypt for safety. Well,
Yep.
here it says that, that she was taken away.
Well, here's the thing too, that Christ. So we have to be careful because we also need to remember that you have big time frames being consolidated to one sentence. Because in one sentence you have both Christ's birth and his ascension. So you got to be careful in terms of saying, well, that's what each of these individually is, and that's all it is, because that's not how Revelation is approaching.
I'm not saying that that's all of it is that, but some verses follow the same pattern as what happened at the time of Jesus' birth.
I mean, yeah, those events are being described, but they're being described providing, again, that broader cosmic perspective of the spiritual, everything spiritual that's going on in the background. So the woman here is representative of the corporate people of Israel. And maybe it'll make more sense if we work through the rest of it, and we can come back if there's more questions. So the next figure we see then is the great red dragon. And the dragon is explained later on, verse 9. He's that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the world. And so when we read the dragon, we should be thinking of Satan, again, describing the spiritual aspect of what's going on connected behind these events. Now he's described here as having 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 diadems as well, as certain kind of crowns. Presenting the dragon in this way, there's a couple things going on. One is this dragon is being presented, or the imagery that's used is meant to communicate a real threat, power and strength, and Satan is described as the ruler of this world, things like that. And so using this kind of imagery, the 7 heads, 10 horns, the crowns as well, his tail sweeping down a third of the stars, that communicates something very powerful, a real threat, so to speak. But in particular, the language of 7 heads, 10 horns, and diadems is going to come up again in Revelation connected with the beast, which is Rome. The dragon itself is not Rome. It's very clearly presented to us as Satan. But by describing the dragon with similar language that's later going to be used to describe the beast, which is Rome, you have this connection being drawn between the two, such that Rome will take on the role later on in Revelation of a satanic persecutor of the church. And so that's part of why I believe the dragon is being presented in this particular fashion, is that later on, when we're reading about the beast and we're reading about Rome, we'll make it a connection between the two, that Rome is not just some random empire, but Rome, as the persecutor of the church, is being influenced by Satan and is working in that fashion. This language here of the tail sweeping down a third of the stars appears to be a reference to the book of Daniel, chapter 8, verse 10. Daniel 8, verse 10 is where you've got, again, language used of different animals, representative of different nations, and horns as individual peoples from those nations as rulers. And for one particular horn, we read, it grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the hosts and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. This particular section is in reference to one of these horns who grows great, and in particular is trampling over Israel, stops the burnt offering for a period of time, and there's a lot of wickedness against Israel, and though he will eventually, that particular horn will be overthrown. And so that language there of the growing great even up to the stars, throwing the stars to the ground, communicates again power, the prominence with which that individual rose, but then also seems to indicate persecution against the church. The fact that the 12 stars in verse 1 are communicating the people of God, and you have this reference to stars here, and stars being thrown down, seems to communicate this idea of persecuting God's people. And so I think that's what's going on here. We're being presented a picture of the power of Satan, the strength of Satan, and Satan persecuting the church and going against the church. And of course, part of the reason for that is for us to see later on the significance of Satan being thrown down and conquered by Christ. That brings us then to the birth of the child. She is described in verse 2 as being in labor. And then later, in verse 5 here, she gives birth. I think part of the significance of the labor language is that among the people of God, you have those prophecies and expectations of the Messiah to come. And in fact, we can even say that at the time when Christ was born, there was an expectation, similar to a mother giving birth, of the fact that the Messiah was meant to come. The testimonies of Simeon and Anna in the temple testified to that. The fact that Simeon knew that he was going to see the salvation of Israel before he died speaks to the fact that there was a very strong expectation that the time had come. It was here for the Messiah to be born. Satan, of course, was also at work at that time period. We have him here described as standing before the woman who's about to give birth. He's getting ready to try to devour her and to destroy the child. That child, of course, that's born is Jesus Christ. We know that especially from the language that he is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. This language is drawn from Psalm 2, verse 9, where, again, prophecy of Jesus Christ. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Revelation 19 is also going to use the same imagery in describing Christ, where it talks about from his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. And so the woman gives birth to the child Jesus, and the dragon seeks to devour the child. We see this in various ways throughout his ministry and throughout his life. Of course, you have Herod at his birth, killing all the children in Bethlehem in that area, 2 years of age and younger. That was a demonic attempt to destroy Christ, influenced by the power of Satan. But that's not the only time where we see Satan trying to destroy Christ during his life. You have the fact that Satan tempted Christ and sought to bring him down and lead him into sin 3 different times. The whole plot of the crucifixion, where Satan entered into Judas to betray Jesus and seek to destroy Christ through the crucifixion. Those are all attempts here fitting this pattern of what's described here as the dragon standing before the woman, seeking to devour the child. But, of course, the dragon is defeated. Satan is thwarted. And we see this again in a variety of ways. Herod is defeated in his attempts to kill the children. Christ defeats Satan when he tempts him. And, of course, the crucifixion is overturned with the resurrection. Then, of course, we have this language here of the child being caught up to God and to his throne. And so here we have the idea that, you really have the entirety of Christ's life with really the bookends there of his birth and his ascension. And the entirety of his ministry is just summed up in those two things. That there is the ultimate example of thwarting of Satan, that Satan is trying to destroy Christ and make war against him. He's thwarted in the birth of Christ. He's thwarted throughout the entire life of Christ. And ultimately, Christ ascends, and Satan can't touch him anymore. Satan is unable to do anything against Christ, because Christ is now in heaven, called up to the throne of God. And then the final thing that we have here in this passage then is the fleeing, which we have in verse 6. For the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. As I mentioned already, this is a second reference to this time period of 1,260 days. This reference in the beginning also of chapter 11. In chapter 11, we talked about how this fits in with the time period of the Jewish War from 67 to 70 AD. And so the fact that you have the same time reference, 1,260 days in chapter 11 and 1,260 days in chapter 12, seem to connect these two things such that the time period of this woman fleeing in verse 6 is that time period before the Jewish War. Again, that makes no sense if this is meant to be interpreted particularly as just Mary, because Mary would be dead. Further, this fits well with the instructions of Christ in historical record that we find. That Christ warned the church in the Olivet Discourse that when you see these things about to take place regarding the destruction of Jerusalem, he says, run. He says, flee. Pray that it will not happen in winter and things like that. And we find that the church took the advice of Christ such that when they saw the time of the destruction of Jerusalem drawing near, they fled and went away. This provided, in a sense, a certain kind of relief for the church that, for the Jews, they were preoccupied with Rome. Rome is coming against Jerusalem. Jerusalem's about to be razed. The temple's going to be destroyed. All those things. And so this was an opportunity for the church to flee that judgment, to escape it, and to be nourished for a time. It's not the end, though, of the story of persecution and war. We'll see that in the rest of the chapter, of course, and of course later on in Revelation, that's very clear as well. But you do have kind of that idea of fleeing in that time period seems to match the description and command of Christ regarding the destruction of Jerusalem for the church to flee to escape the judgment. So I'm going to stop there. These are the first 6 verses. Lord willing, I'm going to try to get through the rest of the chapter next week. We'll see how we do. But any questions or thoughts on this section? Does it make sense so far, what we've covered? All right. I'll take that as it is.
Yeah, I was waiting for everyone to see if there was a question, because I want to go back to the church again, forgive me. But now when I hear the word church, I'm going, is this the visible church or the invisible church we're talking about?
Right.
So I always assume when you see the word church in the Bible, you're talking about the invisible church. Is that correct, or?
Not always.
Okay.
Because Paul's letters are to the church or to the saints in such and such city.
That's true.
He's
Yeah.
talking about a particular localized group of people.
Okay.
For example, he writes to the church in Corinth. Well, there's some messed up people in Corinth. I mean, that's why he has to write about church discipline. So that's why we have to have, that category of invisible and visible, because there is the invisible church. The Bible does talk about, kind of this corporate idea of those that are all children of Abraham who have faith and believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. But then there's the external expression of it, that which we can see, that which is in our localized groups. And we know from experience, there's believers and there's unbelievers in those mixes. And the Bible has to be able to, Bible deals with that. Paul writes and says, so and so fell away. And, he was a partner with me, and then he did me harm and followed after the passions of the world. And so that's why we got to, pay attention to the context sometimes and try to see which is being talked about. Because the Bible does use that language for the invisible and the visible. It doesn't use the language visible and invisible, but that's the language that we use to differentiate when it's talking about two different things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because the church's role is to preach the gospel.
Mhm.
And hopefully those that are not part of the invisible church at the time will eventually become
Yes. Yep.
true Christian.
Yep.
You preach to everybody.
And you can't just assume that everybody in the pew, even if they're a member of the church, is necessarily saved. That's why we continually have to preach the gospel and remind us, just because you never know. Yeah. Any other questions?